8. Women, Caste and Reform. Have you ever thought of how children lived about 200 years ago? Nowadays, most girls from middle class families go to school and often study with boys. On growing up, many of them go to colleges and universities and take up jobs after that. They have to be adults before they are legally married. And according to law, they can marry anyone they like from any caste and community, and widows can remarry too. All women, like all men, can vote and stand for elections. Of course, these rights are not actually enjoyed by all. Poor people have little or no access to education, and in many families, women cannot choose their husbands. Figure Soti, painted by Balthazar Sloven, 1813. This was one of the many pictures of Soti painted by the European artist who came out to India. The practice of Sati was seen as evidence of the barbarisms of the East. 200 years ago, things were very difficult. Most children were married off at an early age. Both Hindu and Muslim men could marry more than one wife. In some parts of the country, widows were praised if they chose death by burning themselves on the funeral pyre of their husbands. Women who died in this manner, whether willingly or otherwise, were called sati, meaning virtuous women. Women's right to property were also restricted. Besides, most women had virtually no access to education. In many parts of the country, people believed that if a woman was educated, she would become a widow. Differences between men and women are not the only ones in society. In most regions, people were divided along lines of caste. Brahmanas and Kshatriyas considered themselves as upper castes. Others, such as traders and moneylenders, often referred to as Vaishyas, were placed after them. Then came peasants and artisans, such as weaver and potter, referred to as Shudras. At the lowest rung were those who labored to keep cities and villages clean or worked at jobs that upper castes considered polluting. That is, it could lead to the loss of caste status. The upper castes also treated many of these groups at the bottom as untouchable. They were not allowed to enter temples, draw water from the wells used by the upper castes, or bath in ponds where upper castes bathed. They were seen as inferior human beings. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, many of these norms and perceptions slowly changed. Let us see how this happened. Working towards change. From the early 19th century, we find debates and discussion about social customs and practices taking on a new character. One important reason for this was the development of new forms of communications. For the first time, books, newspapers, magazines, leaflet and pamphlets were printed. These were far cheaper and far more accessible than the manuscript that you have read about in class 7. Therefore, ordinary people could read this, and many of them could also write and express their ideas in their own languages. All kinds of issues, social, political, economic, and religious, could now be debated and discussed by men and sometimes by women as well. In the new cities, the discussions could reach out to a wider public and could become linked to movements for social change. These debates were often initiated by Indian reformers and reform groups. One such reformer was Raja Ram Mohan Roy, 1772 to 1833. He founded a reform association known as the Brahmo Sabha, later known as the Brahmo Samaj in Calcutta. People such as Ram Mohan Roy as described as reformers because they felt that changes were necessary in society and unjust practices needed to be done away with. They thought that the best way to ensure such changes was to by persuading people to give up old practices and adopt a new way of life activity. Can you think of the ways in which social customs and practices were discussed in the pre-printing age when books, newspaper and pamphlets were not readily available? Comment this. Figure Raja Ram Mohan Roy, painted by Rembrandt Pele, 1833. Ramon Roy was keen to spread the knowledge of Western education in the country and bring about greater freedom and equality for women. He wrote about the way women were forced to bear the burden of domestic work, confined to the home and the kitchen, and not allowed to move out and become educated, changing the lives of widows. Ramon Roy was particularly moved by the problems widows faced in their lives. He began a campaign against the practice of sati. Ramon Roy was well versed in Sanskrit, Persian, and several other Indian and European languages. He tried to show through his writings that the practice of widow burning had no sanction in ancient texts. By the early 19th century, as you have read in chapter 7, many British officials had also begun to criticize Indian traditions and customs. They were therefore more than willing to listen to Ram Mohan, who was reputed to be a learned man. In 1829, sati was banned. The strategy adopted by Ram Mohan was used by later reformers as well. Whenever they wished to challenge a practice that seemed harmful, they tried to find a verse or sentence in the ancient sacred text that supported their point of view. They then suggested that the practice as it existed at present was against early tradition. Figure Hook Swinging Festival. In the popular festival, devotees underwent a peculiar form of suffering as part of ritual worship. With hooks piercing through their skin, they swung themselves on a wheel. In the early 19th century, when European officials began criticizing Indian customs and rituals as barbaric, this was one of the rituals that came under attack. We first tie them down to the pile. Ramon Roy published many pamphlets to spread his ideas. Some of these were written as a dialogue between the advocate and critic of a traditional practice. Here is one such dialogue on sati. Advocate of sati. Women are by nature of inferior understanding, without resolution, unworthy of trust. Many of them, on the death of their husbands, become desirous of accompanying them, but to remove every chance of their trying to escape from the blazing fire in burning them, we first tie them down to the pile. Opponent of sati. When did you ever afford them a fair opportunity of exhibiting their natural capacity? How then can you accuse them of want of understanding? If after instruction in knowledge and wisdom a person cannot comprehend or retain what has been taught him, we may consider him a deficient. But if you do not educate women, how can you see them as inferior? Activity. This argument was taking place more than 175 years ago. Write down the different arguments you may have heard around you on the oath of women. In what ways have the views changed? Comment this. For instance, one of the most famous reformers, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, used the ancient text to suggest that widows could remarry. His suggestion was adopted by British officials, and a law was passed in 1856 permitting widow remarriage. Those who were against the remarriage of widows opposed Vidyasagar and even boycotted him. By the second half of the 19th century, the movement in favor of widow remarriage spread to other parts of the country in the Telugu-speaking areas of the Madras Presidency. Veerasalingam Pantulu formed an association for widow remarriage. Around the same time, young intellectuals and reformers in Bombay pledged themselves to working for the same cause. In the north, Swami Dayanand Saraswati, who founded the reform association called Arya Samaj, also supported widow remarriage. Yet the number of widows who actually remarried remained low. Those who married were not easily accepted in society, and conservative groups continued to oppose the new law. Figure: Swami Dayanand Saraswati. Dayanand founded the Arya Samaj in 1875, an organization that attempted to reform Hinduism. Figure: Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar. Girls began going to school. Many of the reformers felt that education for girls was necessary in order to improve the condition of women. Vidyasagar in Calcutta and many other reformers in Bombay set up school for girls. When the first school were opened in the mid 19th century, many people were afraid of them. They feared that schools would take girls away from home, prevent them from doing their domestic duties. Moreover, girls had to travel through public places in order to reach school. Many people felt that this would have a corrupting influence on them. They felt that girls should stay away from public spaces. Therefore, throughout the 19th century, most educated women were taught at home by liberal fathers or husbands. Sometimes women taught themselves. Do you remember what you read about Rashundari Devi in your book Social and Political last year? She was one of those who secretly learned to read and write in the flickering light of candles at night. In the latter part of the century, schools for girls were established by the Arya Samaj in Punjab and Jyotirao Phule in Maharashtra. In aristocratic Muslim households in North India, women learned to read the Quran in Arabic. They were taught by women who come home to teach. Some reformers, such as Mumtaz Ali, reinterpreted verses from the Quran to argue for women's education. The first Urdu novels began to be written from the late 19th century. Amongst other things, these were meant to encourage women to read about religion and domestic management in a language they could understand. Figure 6. Students of Hindu Mahila Vidyalaya, 1875. When girls' schools were first set up in the 19th century, it was generally believed that the curriculum of girls ought to be less taxing than that for boys. The Hindu Mahila Vidyalaya was one of the first institutions to provide girls with the kind of learning that was usual for boys at the time. Women write about women. From the early 20th century, Muslim women like the Begums of Bhopal played a notable role in promoting education among women. They founded a primary school for girls at Aligarh. Another remarkable woman, Begum Rokeya Sakhat Hossain, started a school for Muslim girls in Patna and Calcutta. She was a fearless critic of conservative ideas, arguing that religious leaders of every faith accorded an inferior place to women. By the 1880s, Indian women began to enter universities. Some of them trained to be doctors, some became teachers. Many women began to write and publish their critical views on the place of women in society. Tarabai Sindhe, a woman educated at home at Pune, published a book, Stri Purush Tulna, a comparison between women and men, criticizing the social differences between men and women. Pandit Ramabai, a great scholar of Sanskrit, felt that Hinduism was oppressive toward women and wrote a book about the miserable lives of upper caste Hindu women. She founded a widow's home at Pune to provide shelters to widows who had been treated badly by the husband's relatives. Here, women were trained so that they could support themselves economically. Figure Pandita Ramabai. Needless to say, all this more than alarmed the Orthodox. For instance, many Hindu nationalists felt that Hindu women were adopting Western ways and that this would corrupt Hindu culture and erode family values. Orthodox Muslims were also worried about the impact of these changes. As you can see, by the end of the 19th century, women themselves were actively working for reform. They wrote books, edited magazines, founded schools and training centers, and set up women's associations. From the early 20th century, they formed political pressure groups to push through laws for female suffrage, the right to vote, and better health care and education for women. Some of them joined various kinds of nationalist and socialist movements from the 1920s. In the 20th century, leaders such as Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose lent their supports to demand for greater equality and freedom for women. Nationalist leaders promised that there would be full suffrage for all men and women after independence. However, till then they asked women to concentrate on the anti-British struggles. Source 2. Once a woman's husband has died. In her book, Stri Purush Tulna, Tarabai Sindhe wrote, "Is not a woman's life as dear to her as yours is to you? It's as if women are meant to be made of something different from men altogether, made from dust from earth or rock or rusted iron, whereas you and your lips are made from the purest gold." You are asking me what I mean? I mean once a woman's husband had died, what I am stored for her. The barber comes to shave all the curls and hair of her head just to cool your eyes. She is shut out from going to weddings, receptions and other auspicious occasions that married women go to. And why all these restrictions? Because her husband has died. She is unlucky. Ill fate is written on her forehead. Her face is not to be seen. It's a bad omen. Tarabai Sindhe Stri Purush Tulna. Law against child marriage. With the growth of women's organizations and writings on these issues, the momentum for reform gained strength. People challenged another established custom, that of child marriage. There were a number of Indian legislators in the Central Legislative Assembly who fought to make a law preventing child marriage. In 1929, the Child Marriage Restraint Act was passed without the kind of bitter debates and struggles that earlier laws had seen. According to the Act, no man below the age of 18 and woman below the age of 16 could marry. Subsequently, these limits were raised to 21 for men and 18 for women. Figure: bride at the age of 8. This is a picture of a child bride at the beginning of the 20th century. Did you know that even today over 20% of girls in India are married below the age of 18? Comment this. Caste and social reform. Some of the social reformers we have been discussing also criticized caste inequalities. Ram Mohan Roy translated an old Buddhist text that was critical of caste. The Parthana Samaj adhered to the tradition of bhakti that believed in spiritual equality of all castes in Bombay. The Paramhans Mandali was founded in 1840 to work for the abolition of caste. Many of these reformers and members of reform associations were people of upper castes, often in secret meetings. These reformers would violate caste taboos on food and touch in an effort to get rid of the hold of caste prejudice in their lives. There were also others who questioned the injustice of the caste social order. During the course of the 19th century, Christian missionaries began setting up schools for tribal groups and lower caste children. These children were thus equipped with some resources to make their way into a changing world. At the same time, the poor began leaving their villages to look for jobs that were opening up in the cities. There was work in the factories that were coming up and jobs in municipalities. You have read about the expansion of cities in Chapter 6. Think of the new demands of labor this created. Drains had to be dug, roads laid, buildings constructed, and cities cleaned. This required coolies, diggers, caddies, bricklayers, sewage cleaners, sweepers, palanquins bearers, rickshaw pullers. Where did this labor come from? The poor from the villages and small towns, many of them from low castes, began moving to the cities where there was a new demand for labor. Some also went to work in plantations in Assam, Mauritius, Trinidad, and Indonesia. Work in the new locations was often very hard, but the poor, the people from low castes, saw this as an opportunity to get away from the oppressive hold that upper caste landowners exercised over their lives and the daily humiliations they suffered. Figure a coolie ship, 19th century. This coolie ship named John Allen carried many Indian laborers to Mauritius where they did a variety of forms of hard labor. Most of these laborers were from low castes who could produce shoes. Leather workers have been traditionally held in contempt since they work with dead animals, which are seen as dirty and polluting during the First World War. However, there was a huge demand for shoes for the armies. Caste prejudice against leather work meant that only the traditional leather workers and shoemakers were ready to supply army shoes, so they could ask for high prices and gain impressive profits. Figure Madigas making shoes, 19th century Andhra Pradesh. Madigas were an important untouchable caste of present-day Andhra Pradesh. They were experts at cleaning hides, tanning them for use and sewing sandals. There were other jobs too. The army, for instance, offered opportunities. A number of Mahar people who were regarded as untouchable found jobs in the Mahar regiment. The father of B.R. Ambedkar, the leader of the Dalit movement, taught at an army school. No place inside the classroom. In the Bombay Presidency, as late as 1829, untouchables were not allowed into even government schools. When some of them pressed hard for that right, they were allowed to sit on the veranda outside the classroom and listen to the lessons without polluting the room where upper caste boys were taught. Figure Doblas of Gujarat carrying mangoes to the market. Doblas labored for upper caste landowners cultivating their fields and working at a variety of odd jobs at the landlord's house. Activity 1. Imagine that you are one of the students sitting in the school veranda and listening to the lessons. What kind of questions would be rising in your mind? Comment this. 2. Some people thought this situation was better than the total lack of education for untouchable people. Would you agree with this view? Comment this. Demands for equality and justice. Gradually, by the second half of the 19th century, people from within the non-Brahmin caste began organizing movements against caste discrimination and demanded social equality and justice. The Tsatonami movement in central India was founded by Ghasidas who worked among the leather workers and organized a movement to improve their social status. In eastern Bengal, Haridas Thakur's Matua sect worked among Chandala cultivators. Haridas questions Brahmanical texts that supported the caste system. In what is present-day Kerala, a guru from Ejava caste, Sri Narayan Guru proclaimed the ideals of unity for his people. He argued against treating people unequally on the basis of caste differences. According to him, all humankind belong to the same caste. One of his famous statements was Oru Jati, Oru Matam, Oru Daivam, Manushanu. One caste, one religion, and one God for humankind. All these sects were founded by leaders who came from non-Brahman castes and worked amongst them. They tried to change those habits and practices which provoked the contempt of dominant caste. They tried to create a sense of self-esteem among the subordinate castes. Figure Sri Narayan Guru. Gulamgiri. One of the most vocal amongst the low-caste leaders was Jyotirao Phule, born in 1827. His studies in schools set up by Christian missionaries. On growing up, he developed his own ideas about the injustice of caste society. He set out to attack the Brahmanas, claimed that they were superior to others. Since they were Aryans, Phule argued that the Aryans were foreigners who came from outside the subcontinent and defeated and subjugated the true children of the country. Those who had lived here from before the coming of the Aryans, as the Aryans established their dominance, they began looking at the defeated population as inferior, as low caste people. According to Phule, the upper castes had no right to their land and power. In reality, the land belonged to indigenous people, the so-called low castes. Figure Jyotirao Phule. Phule claimed that before Aryan rule, there existed a golden age when warrior peasants tilled the land and ruled the Maratha countryside in just and fair way. He proposed that Shudras laboring caste and Ati Shudras untouchables should unite to challenge caste discrimination. The Shutta Shodhak Samaj, an association Phule founded, propagated caste equality. Source 3. Me here and you over there. Phule was also critical of the anti-colonial nationalism that was preached by upper caste leaders. He wrote, the Brahmanas have hidden away the sword of their religion, which has cut the throat of the people's prosperity, and now go about posing as great patriots of their country. They give this advice to our Shudra, Muslim and Parsi youth that unless we put away all quarreling amongst ourselves about the divisions between high and low in our country and come together, our country will never make any progress. It will be unity to serve their purposes, and then it will be me here and you over there again. Jyotiba Phule, the cultivator's whipcord. Activity. Careful, read source 3. What do you think Jyotirao Phule meant by me here and you over there again? Comment this. In 1873, Phule wrote a book named Gulamgiri, meaning slavery. Some 10 years before this, the American Civil War had been fought, leading to the end of slavery in America. Phule dedicated his book to all those Americans who had fought to free slaves, thus establishing a link between the conditions of the lower caste in India and the back slaves in America. As this example shows, Phule extended his criticisms of this caste system to argue against all forms of inequality. He was concerned about the plight of upper caste women, the miseries of the laborers, and the humiliation humiliations of the low castes. This movement for caste reforms was continued in the 20th century by other great Dalit leaders like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar in western India and E.V. Ramaswamy Natikar in the south. We are also human beings. In 1927, Ambedkar said, "We now want to go to the tank only to prove that, like others, we are also human beings." Hindu society should be reorganized on two main principles: equality and absence of casteisms. Who could enter temples? Ambedkar was born into a Mahar family. As a child, he experienced what caste prejudice meant in everyday life. In school, he was forced to sit outside the classroom on the ground and was not allowed to drink water from taps that upper caste children used. After finishing school, he got a fellowship to go to the US for higher studies. On his return to India in 1919, he wrote extensively about upper caste power in contemporary society. In 1927, Ambedkar started a temple entry movement in which his Mahar caste followers participated. Brahmin priests were outraged when the Dalits used the water from the temple tank. Ambedkar led three such movements for temple entry between 1927 and 1935. His aim was to make everyone see the power of caste prejudices within society. Figure: the gateway to the Madurai temple, drawn by Thomas Daniel, 1792. Untouchables were not allowed anywhere near such gateways until the temple entry movement began. The non-Brahman movement. Figure: E.V. Ramaswamy Natikar Periyar. In the early 20th century, the non-Brahman movement started. The initiative came from those non-Brahman castes that had acquired access to education, wealth, and influence. They argued that Brahmins were heirs of Aryan invaders from the north who had conquered southern lands from the original inhabitants of the regions. The indigenous Dravidian races, they also challenged Brahmanical claims to power. E.V. Ramaswamy Natikar, or Periyar as he was called, came from a middle-class family. Interestingly, he had been an ascetic in his early life and had studied Sanskrit scriptures carefully. Later, he became a member of the Congress only to leave it in disgust when he found that at a feast organized by nationalists, sitting arrangements followed caste distinctions. That is, the lower caste were made to sit at a distance from the upper caste. Convinced that untouchables had to fight for their dignity, Periyar founded the self-respect movement. He argued that untouchables were the true upholders of an original Tamil and Dravidian cultures which had been subjugated by Brahmanas. He felt that all religious authorities saw social divisions and inequality as God-given. Untouchables had to free themselves, therefore, from all religions in order to achieve social equality. Periyar was an outspoken critic of Hindu scriptures, especially the codes of Manu, the ancient lawgiver, and the Bhagavad Gita and the Ramayana. He said that these texts had been used to establish the authority of Brahmins over lower caste and the domination of men over women. Source 5. Periyar on Oman. Periyar wrote, "Only with the arrival of words such as Thara, Mukurtham, our women had become puppets in the hands of their husbands. We ended up with such fathers who advised their daughters that they had been gifted away to their husbands and they belonged to their husbands' place. This is the result of our associations with Sanskrit." Periyar, cited in Periyar Chintanaikal. These assertions did not go unchallenged. The forceful speeches, writing, and movements of lower caste leaders did lead to rethinking and some self-criticisms among upper caste nationalist leaders. But Orthodox Hindu society also reacted by founding Sanatan Dharma Sabhas and the Bharat Dharma Mahamandal in the north and associations like the Brahman Sabha in Bengal. The object of these associations was to uphold caste distinctions as a cornerstone of Hinduism and show how this was sanctified by scriptures. Debates and struggles over caste continued beyond the colonial period and are still going on in our own times. Activity. Why does caste remain such a controversial issue today? What do you think was the most important movement against caste in colonial times? Comment this. Organizing for reform. Figure Keshav Chundar Sen, one of the main leaders of the Brahmo Samaj. The Brahmo Samaj. The Brahmo Samaj formed in 1830 prohibited all forms of idolatry and sacrifice, believed in the Upanishads and forbade its members from criticizing others' religious practices. It critically drew upon the ideals of religions, especially of Hinduism and Christianity, looking at their negative and positive dimensions. Figure Henry Derozio. Derozio and Young Bengal. Henry Louis Vivian Derozio, a teacher at Hindu College, Calcutta in the 1820s, promoted radical ideas and encouraged his pupils to question all authority, referred to as the Young Bengal movement. His students attacked tradition and customs, demanded education for women, and campaigned for the freedom of thought and expressions. Figure Swami Vivekananda. The Ramakrishna Mission and Swami Vivekananda. Named after Ramakrishna Paramhamsa, Swami Vivekananda's guru, the Ramakrishna Mission stressed the ideal of salvation through social service and selfless action. Swami Vivekananda 1863 to 1902, whose original name was Narendranath Datta, combined the simple teachings of Sri Ramakrishna with his well-founded modern outlook and spread them all over the world. After hearing him in the World Parliament of Religions at Chicago in 1893, the New York Herald reported, "We feel how foolish it is to send missionaries to this learned nation." Indeed, Swami Vivekananda was the first Indian in modern times who re-established the spiritual preeminence of the Vedanta philosophy on a global scale. But his mission was not simply to talk of religion. He was extremely pained at the poverty and the misery of his countrymen. He firmly believed that any reform could become successful only by uplifting the condition of the masses. Therefore, his clarion call to the people of India was to rise above the narrow confines of their religion of the kitchen and come together in the service of the nation. By sending out this call, he made a signal contribution to the nascent nationalisms of India. His sense of nationalism was, however, not narrow in its conception. He was convinced that many of the problems facing the mankind could only be overcome if the nations of the world come together on an equal footing. Therefore, his exhortations to the youth was to unite on the basis of a common spiritual heritage. In these exhortations, he became truly the symbol of a new spirit and a source of strength for the future. The Prarthana Samaj. Established in 1867 at Bombay, the Prarthana Samaj sought to remove caste restriction, abolish child marriage, encourage the education of women, and end the ban on widow remarriage. Its religious meetings drew upon Hindu, Buddhist and Christian texts. The Veda Samaj. Established in Madras, Chennai in 1864, the Veda Samaj was inspired by the Brahmo Samaj. It worked to abolish caste distinctions and promote widow remarriage and women's education. Its members believed in the one God. They condemned the superstitions and rituals of Orthodox Hinduism. Figure Sayyid Ahmed Khan. The Aligarh movement. The Mohammedan Anglo-Oriental College founded by Sayyid Ahmed Khan in 1874 at Aligarh later became the Aligarh Muslim University. The institution offered modern education, including Western science, to Muslims. The Aligarh movement, as it was known, had an enormous impact in the area of educational reform. The Singh Sabha movement. Reform organizations of the Sikh. The first Singh Sabhas were formed at Amritsar in 1873 and at Lahore in 1879. The Sabhas sought to rid Sikhism of superstitions, caste distinctions, and practices seen by them as non-Sikh. They promoted education among the Sikhs, often combining modern instruction with Sikh teachings. Figure Khalsa College, Amritsar, established in 1892 by the leaders of the Singh Sabha movement. Elsewhere, black slaves and white planters. You have read about how Jyotirao Phule established a connection in his book Gulamgiri between caste oppressions and the practice of slavery in America. What was this system of slavery? From the time that European explorers and traders landed in Africa in the 17th century, a trade in slaves began. Black people were captured and brought from Africa to America, sold to white planters, and made to work on cotton and other plantations, most of them in the southern United States. In the plantations, they had to work long hours, typically from dawn to dusk, punished for inefficient work, and whipped and tortured. Many people, white and black, opposed slavery through organized protest. In doing so, they invoked the spirit of the American Revolution of 1776, exhorting, "See your declaration, Americans, do you understand your own language?" In his moving Gettysburg Address, Abraham Lincoln held that those who had fought slavery had done so for the cause of democracy. He urged the people to strive for racial equality so that government of the people, by the people, for the people shall not perish from the earth. Figure Slave Shell, Slave Cell, South Carolina, USA, 1856. Here you see potential buyers examining African slaves at an auction. Let's imagine. Imagine you are a teacher in your school set up by Rokeya Hossein. There are 20 guards in your church. Write an account of the discussions that might have taken place on any one day in the school. Comment this. Let's recall. Let's discuss. Do this and comment this.